waterfall in the room.
Okay, well, I want to welcome everybody here. Glad you came to hear about good old Utica. The butt of many jokes. Somebody was asking me where Utica is, and I showed them this map, and Dick Cavett called Utica the jewel in the navel of New York. And everybody in Utica got real upset because it was too sexy. So that's part of Utica's important history there. What I'm going to talk about, I really owe a lot to the Oneida County Freedom Trail Commission, who's done a lot of research, as well as the Oneida County Historical Society, as well as Milton Sernett, who was a professor of African American history at Syracuse University, and he's got some great books about this area and this period that we're going to cover. So, on 4 consecutive Sundays, in November and December of 1832, in the basement chapel of the Western Reserve College, situated in Hudson, Ohio, a wholly committed Bible scholar preached 4 fiery sermons. The subjects were, be good rather than be practical, give up prejudices, if you see a great wrong, you must act against it, and love thy brother. Those 4 innocuous sounding topics got Reverend Beriah Green forced out of the college because he wasn't simply quoting scripture, he was talking about slavery and about the bloody guilt that stained everybody who stands by and does nothing. By the way, at the time that we're talking about, Beriah Green is described as a fresh-faced, sandy-haired, rather common-looking man. So you got to picture him as a young guy with like righteous anger on his side. This is because it's an actual photograph, it's from way beyond when we're talking about.
What kind of church was this?
He is a Presbyterian. So Green's next job is in the town of Whitesboro at the Oneida Institute of Science and Technology. It's just down the road from Utica. Before he agrees to be the president there, he makes 2 demands. One, that he will be able to continue to preach abolition and teach abolition, and the other, that any student who has reformist zeal and who is willing to learn be admitted. And what that meant when the board agreed to it was that black and white students would be admitted equally, they would get equal degrees, and that there would be no difference between the students. So the Oneida Institute is the first in the nation to have a goodly number of black students receiving degrees. He arrives with his family on August 7th, 1833, and by doing so he adds to the strength and the enthusiasm that is already beginning in Utica among some. After Green's arrival, the first anti-slavery society in New York State is organized on abolitionist principles and immediate principles formed by the students at Oneida Institute. And when Green is traveling and preaching, he does everything that he can to talk about the fight against the sin of slavery, and he helps organize anti-slavery societies in Rochester and in Syracuse. In December 1833, he is at the American Anti-Slavery Convention in Philadelphia, and he ends up getting made their presiding officer. So he's gaining a reputation outside of central New York, and that's important. Anyway, did people hear about the controversy about the seal of the town of Whitesboro? The Daily Show, Jessica Williams, it came up, right? So Whitesboro's right next to Utica. Okay, the seal in question, if you didn't get it, she brought the attention of this seal to a wider audience. This allegedly depicts the wrestling match between the founder of Whitesboro, Hugh White, and one of the members of the Haudenosaunee tribe. Mr. White won, gaining the respect of the local tribe. Because of Jessica Williams' story, there was an uproar, and they had to go ahead and change the seal reluctantly. Unfortunately, I wish that they had embraced the history of the Oneida Institute so they could have a positive truly Whitesboro kind of thing, because here's the first school to allow both black and white students together, and they could have used that instead of, I think they ended up with a handshake thing of, anyway. So let's go back to the 1830s. So we have this radical, Beriah Green, firmly installed in the Utica and Whitesboro area. And I'm sure everybody here knows what abolition stood for. It was the immediate ending of slavery with no compensation to the slaveholders. So you all probably are sort of familiar with the American Colonization Society. They are the sort of sanctioned society. They are very mainstream. Their opposition to slavery, in their opposition to slavery, they believe that people of African descent should be sent to Africa, regardless of where they're born. They're for the withering away of slavery, and some thought that the South was going to give up their main source of wealth voluntarily. And some members of the society are really genuinely against slavery in their opposition, and they want it to end through self-liberation or immediate principle of emancipation, or by state legislating away the withering away of the practice. But there's also the racists in there who can't tolerate people of color, and the slaveholders who find the society very handy because they want to get rid of the free African Americans, who they see as potential organizers of a general insurrection. Paul Cuffey was, he sort of came up with the idea of having a colony in Africa. He was a very successful Quaker ship owner and abolitionist, and he was for resettling people in Africa. He was half African, half Native American. In 1815, he brought 38 black colonists to Sierra Leone and laid some of the basis for the practice. He died before he could make a return trip, but he felt that the overwhelming racism in the United States was never going to be overcome, and if people were going to live a full life, that they had to get out of the United States. This is in 1822, the American Colonization Society begins sending African American volunteers to the Pepper Coast of Africa to form the country that would eventually become Liberia. And that's Liberia there, and in this picture, that's Liberia. They won money from Congress for the colonization of Liberia, and they controlled, the American Colonization Society controlled the situation there until 1847. And they existed even beyond that, but after there was a revolution, I mean, they declared their independence, it wasn't a revolution. They no longer were completely in charge. Some of the black community leaders were for this idea, but they met very stiff opposition in their own communities. This is Mother Bethel Church in Philadelphia, and they held a meeting on September 20th through 24th in 1830, and 38 delegates formed the American Society of Free Persons of Color, and they made it clear in their statement that, quote, that colonizing Africa does not meet with our approbation. The vehement rejection took some of the leaders by surprise. And there's already plenty of problems in Liberia. This says, this is people who, this doesn't say this, but the people who were transported there, there's tropical diseases, and there was as much as, in some times, a 50% death rate of people who moved there. This is an article from the Oneida, Oneida Whig, and you can see that there were problems already. Throughout this presentation, there's some language that was used in the 1830s that we don't use today, but I'm just going to read it. Liberia, it will be seen from an article taken from the New York Journal of Commerce that one of the Liberian settlements had been attacked by one of the Negro chiefs and utterly destroyed, with the loss of life of nearly every inhabitant. So it's clear that people living along the coast of Africa weren't exactly happy about the growing colony there and their land getting stolen. Ultimately, the Colonization Society transports about 12,000 people of color to Liberia.
Excuse me, but
Yeah.
were they stealing the land?
I honestly don't know if there was deals with some of the tribes on that coast or not. There might have been, deals with some and not deals with other. But, I mean, was Manhattan stolen? There was a deal,
Whoever
so.
sold the land was the guy who owned it, which didn't necessarily mean local law.
Well, not only that, yeah, I mean, there's a different tradition about what the land means and whether one can sell or not sell the land, I would think. I know it was true in the United States, and it may well have been true there. I don't know completely the answer to your question. But I have an opinion about it, obviously, right? Okay. So, in January 1834, the main agent for the American Colonization Society, Reverend Joshua N. Danforth, comes to Utica to give his stump speech and to get a vote on the following resolution. That this meeting deeply deplore the unfortunate condition of the colored population in this country and commend to the zealous support of the philanthropist and the Christian the American Colonization Society as an instrument under Providence which is best calculated to ameliorate the condition of the free Negro and secure ultimate emancipation for the slaves. So he's come to Utica, he wants this to get passed. The first day they talk about it, he gives his reasons. And just a little bit before he arrived in Utica, he published this, which is the 12 reasons why all people of New England should engage heart and hand in supporting the Colonization Society. This is April 1833. I'm going to just characterize the 12 reasons that, the Colonization Society encourages engagement with slaveholders in the South so as not to antagonize them, but to encourage them. They will not be able to give up their slaves if there's no place for the people to go. Indeed, some places at that time there were laws against freeing people. You might have to put up a big bond in order to guarantee the behavior of the person who you're trying to free. By engaging in the masters, they can show that white workers could be hired and fired on a seasonal basis, and this will be cheaper and more productive. And they say that the price of the land will fall because there'll be a competition with the farms the plantations that use white laborers who they can hire and fire, and the ones who are using enslaved people who they must support. The society urges thought, discussion, plans, and contributions for the benefit of the colored people. In the Liberian colony, people of color will be able to vote, they'll be able to have laws written by themselves, act as judges, and sit on juries, something that will never be able to happen in the United States. The colony will both retard the slave trade and have products to sell rather than slaves, and that the society would be a moral lever under the foundation of the slave system, which must eventually effect its overthrow. And finally, by removing free blacks, it will reduce the temptation to idleness, quote, idleness, insubordination, and insurrection. So that's like the 12, that's his argument. So he's in Utica. You see the Oneida Institute is that way to Whitesboro. The debates are here in 1834 at the First Presbyterian Church. Okay, did I say Presbyterian when you asked me? Okay, sure. All right. On the first night, Danforth speaks. They lay out this resolution, and somehow it's decided that Beriah Green, our friend Beriah Green, is going to answer him over the next 2 nights. Other speakers will include the abolitionist lawyer, Alvin Stewart, and an interesting guy who I've been digging into, which is Alexander B. Johnson. He is a public intellectual. He's fairly well known, but he was also a slaveholder in Utica, one of the few. And anyway, interest in Utica is very high. The church where this happened is packed every night. So Beriah Green counters Danforth's arguments with over 2 nights, so it's too numerous for me to exactly say what, but I did pull out some interesting things from some of his sermons. Has not the North helped establish slavery? Is not the North doing certain things to maintain slavery? To do nothing is a choice to support the ills of slavery. If one is silent, then they are allowing slavery to continue unopposed. The prejudice against African Americans has its origins in slavery and needs to be maintained by the slaveholders to keep slaves and to keep free black people down. In the name of preserving the Union, people are kidnapped in daylight and held in horrible prisons before they are sold into the misery of slavery. In the name of preserving Union rights, the Union rights of people are being trampled. There are attacks on the mail. There are attacks on freedom of speech, the right to assemble, and the right to private property. Vast amounts of capital are used to prop up the system. We are all paying those expenses. Violence underlies the entire system. The South fears the truth will come out. Books are banned and altered. What system is so shaky that a paragraph of a book can shake it? American slavery is a fraud, adultery, and murder. All human beings are free and must be enslaved in order to become slaves. They're born free, must be enslaved. The laws of the South make human beings as chattel. The enslaved are also children of God, same as us. So that's Green's argument, basically, over these 2 nights. The Common Council of Utica decides to get into the act, and they pass a resolution stating, whereas certain individuals now in our city are disturbing the peace and good citizens thereof by incalculating sentiments which we deem demoralizing in themselves and little short of treason toward the government of our country. Therefore we resolve, we the Common Council of the City of Utica regard the agitation in the question of Negro slavery as it exists in the southern states of this republic to be highly inexpedient at the present juncture of our national affairs. That's just the discussion of it. And it can only tend to keep alive the dying embers of internal discord. We fondly hope and believe that those embers will be extinguished, if not deliberately, if not distributed by the zeal of misguided philanthropists. And they end by saying, we heartily disapprove of all measures calculated to interfere with the rights of our southern brethren to them by the Constitution of the United States. So this is the defense of the slave owners. So on the 4th night of this debate, Danforth's resolution carries. There's a vote, and the motion carries. The Journal of Commerce reports that people of color at the event, that there were people of color at the event, but asserts that most of them voted for the resolution. And I feel like how they vote or how they felt they must vote is not the most significant part of this information. It's that there's a presence of African American people at this debate. And it shows that the black population of Utica is engaged with the debate. And it is not unusual for meetings like this to be segregated and for nobody to be allowed in, no people of color. It also counters the characterization by Danforth that people are full of idleness, insubordination, and insurrection. The debate ends and the motion passes. A day or 2 later, a white mob builds 2 straw effigies, one of Beriah Green and the other of this abolitionist lawyer, Alvin Stewart, who apparently spoke out about temperance, abstaining from alcohol. So the effigies get hung on a gallows, and across the top of the gallows, they allegedly quote Stewart and Green. They say that Green said that the Constitution was only fit for devils, and that they attack temperance as well. A barrel of pine tar is produced and rolls around the city, up and down Genesee Street, with the gallows, with people blowing horns and ringing bells, and the effigies are tarred and feathered and set on fire, along with issues of the Temperance Recorder. So they're really mad about the temperance thing, too. This is not from that particular riot, but from something else. The rioters celebrate the mock death and the funeral of the Friends of Abolition and dance around the fire in a state of drunkenness. Riot rages up and down Genesee Street, and nobody shows up to stop them. Nobody is arrested. It just happens, and it's reported in several newspapers. And this is the quote from the Oswego Free Press. A disgraceful riot took place in Utica on Wednesday evening when a couple of gentlemen were burned in effigy. It seems that a portion of the citizens have become very much excited by the course taken by those persons in the cause of anti-slavery and intemperance. I'm not saying that this exactly follows that, but it's later in this year that Reverend Danforth from the Colonization Society resigns. So he was their main agent. He was traveling all over and resigned soon after this debate. Later that year, in June 3rd, 1834, the Utica Anti-Slavery Society is founded with Alvin Stewart at its head, and Beriah Green deeply involved, as are many others. So I was completely ignorant about how big the struggle against slavery was in the early 1800s, you know, when I think about it, or when we see shows like, did people watch Underground? I did. You know, Roots is on, you know, for some reason I just sort of put it all in the 1850s and 1860s, but I was wrong. It was on everybody's mind. It was in the newspapers constantly. And they never talked about it in Utica's school system, which I went through, or in Clinton, New York, just 10 miles away. But here it is. There's a big problem, a moral, political, and economic problem having to do with slavery, and there's not a lot of choices, right? You can do nothing and just have it continue. You can end it gradually and send people to Liberia, or there was talk of other colonies on the other side of the Mississippi and some other ideas about colonies, or you can end it immediately. And the pressure to solve the problem of slavery is gathering, and one of the main pressure is coming from the enslaved themselves. They are rebelling from the moment that slavery existed. And I don't know if people are familiar with this book. It's not a new book, obviously, but it's one of the first books that takes a huge survey of the papers and periodicals starting, it's in the mid-1700s, I believe, that he starts. And he goes and he documents every time there is a suspicious burning, any kind of plot that's talked about. He has made a huge study and characterized it in terms of dates. And this book is still available. I highly recommend it. It's not like, you know, fantastically interesting, but it's like a great resource to know what was going on. So there's that huge amount of pressure coming from the enslaved. And this happens. High-pressure steam engine. It's not apparent in the South, where the production of agricultural products is still yielding sufficient profits to make the keeping of slaves economically viable. More powerful steam engines come to be invented in the early 1800s, and it's really one of the most significant developments in terms of transforming labor from small production to mass production. It's the beginning of the machine age. Part of the reason the national government won the Civil War is because they could outproduce the South in terms of weapons, ammunition, and supplies. So these massive steam engines not only transform production, but they also transform printing. All of a sudden, you don't have to like be the one guy turning this giant wheel which presses the type down on a piece of paper and then take the one piece of paper. You know, suddenly you have a steam engine running this boom, boom, boom. And so all of a sudden there's penny presses and flyers and abolitionist broadsheets that can be mass produced. The tap-ins, and you'll see one of the tap-ins in a minute, they start sending huge amount of abolitionist papers to the South, to the point where the postmasters in the South won't deliver them. They won't send them anywhere. As a matter of fact, they take them out and in some cases burn them. And this goes all the way to Washington, and the Postmaster General says, "Yeah, I would have done it too," you know. The local elites are nervous because the outsiders are coming in with this abolitionist newspapers. They're worried that it's going to get into the hands of the enslaved, and they're already rebellious. And if you get more information, you see that your struggle has solidarity coming toward you that, you know, could change how you behave. Okay, another riot in Utica, 1835. As I said, Alvin Stewart, his effigy was burned alongside Beriah Green. If you look at this, I mean, Utica's not huge. This is 1839, and you know, it's bigger now for sure. Just keep an eye on that circle up there. So this is Alvin Stewart's house, and these red dots represent everybody from the Colonization Society. I mean, he's living in a kind of posh neighborhood. You know, they're all doing really well up there, but you know, just that one little part of Utica, you look at it, it's like he's kind of surrounded. In the summer of 1835, abolitionists in New York City decide that they want to hold a statewide convention to form a New York State Anti-Slavery Society to try to consolidate all of the movement. And they choose Utica because Beriah Green and Alvin Stewart are there. They figure they got a couple guys who are brave, who are going to stand up to whatever comes. In August, notices go up around Utica announcing the convention for October 21st at the Bleecker Street Church. This is the Second Presbyterian Church. So here's the First Presbyterian Church where the debates were. Here's the Abolition Convention. And the leaders of Utica go crazy. There's all kinds of articles in the newspapers in Utica, and then further out there's articles in the southern papers, total denunciations of these meetings. There's meetings in Utica where if the abolitionists meet, they're disrupted by people, you know, jumping up and shouting in the meeting. And the Colonization Society is the one leading this charge against the abolitionists. And they're having huge meetings where abolition immediate principles are vilified. So despite all of this tension, hundreds of men, probably about 400 to 500, maybe more, show up at the Second Presbyterian Church. Anyway, the meeting is called to order by Alvin Stewart, and the business that will officially begin the New York Anti-Slavery Society is begun. Meanwhile, at the courthouse, a group from the Utica branch of the American Colonization Society has pulled themselves together to demand that the convention, happening just a little bit away, be disbanded. They get themselves together into a committee of 25, and they march over to the Second Presbyterian Church. These are the guys who are in power in Utica, including gentlemen of property and standing. Samuel Beardsley, he's the leader of the Committee of 25. He was both in the New York State Senate. He was serving in the U.S. House of Representatives at the time of this incident. Alexander B. Johnson, I mentioned. He was a slaveholder in Utica. And what's weird is that there's a park in the middle of the black community in Utica, Johnson Park. And people didn't realize that he was a slaveholder. And that we had a meeting on the 180th anniversary of this riot. And when I said that he was a slaveholder, I mean, there were gasps in the church we were in. Joseph Kirkland, he was the mayor when this was going on, but he decided to be out of town that night. Very wise. John Devereaux, future mayor. Horatio Seymour, you might recognize his name. He became a mayor of Utica and then went on to be governor of New York State in 1853. J. Watson Williams, future mayor. Edmund Wetmore, future mayor. What's funny is that his father, a Revolutionary War veteran, is inside the church. he's the secretary of the meeting. He's taking the notes. He's the guy who like got the permits at one point to have the meeting in the courthouse.
What party?
I'm not sure.
Are these guys Northern Whigs?
Probably mostly Whigs.
So they all become know-nothings?
I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, I haven't, in terms of studying, like, I sort of get the whole party thing then. Some of them were probably for Van Buren. There is a theory that this opposition was organized in order to support Van Buren, because Van Buren was being seen as being pro-abolitionist, and he put out word that, you know, to crank it up a little bit so that the South didn't think he was for abolition. So that's what I
I think Seymour becomes a know-nothing. I think that's what these guys are.
He wasn't, yeah, I wouldn't doubt that they're Whigs, but they might be Democrats, some of them, I'm not sure. So anyway, the Committee of 25 included these guys, and also the postmaster, the editor of the Utica Observer, an assessor, an alderman, a good number of lawyers, 3 people from the Common Council, a bookkeeper, a judge, and a bunch of men of business. So they and a group of about 45 other men, gentlemen, those are the gentlemen, march over to the church. And behind them, the crowd that's been whipped up by all of this excitement follows them over to the church. There's apparently was some liquor distributed. They go into the church and they disrupt completely. A guy brings his dogs in, his hunting dogs, and releases them, and they're running all over barking. There's tussling, there's hymnals thrown, somebody's jacket gets ripped off. People are yelling to get Alvin Stewart out of there. It completely stops the convention and causes a general disturbance. Let's just, for 1 second before I go on, at the convention there's representatives from every county in New York State. There's local abolitionists there like John DeLong, who's a member of the Common Council, who is an Underground Railroad conductor. There's Reverend Whitmore, who I mentioned before. His son is future mayor. And then there's Spencer Kellogg, and he comes up again in our story. He becomes the mayor of Utica a little bit later. There's Charles Stewart. This is taken from a painting of the English, there was a meeting of the English Anti-Slavery Society, and it had all of these faces in it, and this is one of him. So he was a principal at the Utica Academy, and he, as the whole thing is being disrupted, Garrett Smith jumps up and says, listen, come to Peterborough, and you're going to be able to meet in peace. So he's on his way to Peterborough. It's very rainy, very muddy. He gets to Vernon, he goes into an inn, he's asleep. The owner of the place comes and says, there's guys outside, they want you to come out, you know. And he's like, rolls over, I'll talk to them tomorrow morning, you know, like go back to sleep. At this meeting, there was also several nationally known abolitionists. I mentioned Tappan before. This is Lewis Tappan, is half of a brother, 2 brothers, Lewis and Arthur Tappan, who are silk merchants, very rich. They own abolitionist newspapers. So they're threatened in the Southern press based on the fact that this meeting is happening. There's a bounty put on his head, his brother's head. But Lewis Tappan later, he organizes a successful legal defense for the captives of the Amistad. So he was in Utica. And then there's a brilliant African-American abolitionist, David Ruggles from New York. He's a writer, he's an Underground Railroad conductor. Before, you know, the term was invented. He found Frederick Douglass at the port in New York and brought him to his house. They become great friends. They talk all night about abolition, and Douglass, gets his wife to come up, or his future wife, and they're married at Ruggles' house. Ruggles also goes back after the Utica riot to found the Vigilance Committee, And this is an active way for the African American free communities to protect themselves from being kidnapped, as well as help people who are escaping or who have been captured in New York City. They were going to the harbors to look for illegal trafficking and doing all kinds of things. They were very practical abolitionists, meaning that they were willing to do what it took. They weren't just into moral suasion. If they had to get somebody out secretly, they would do that. If they had to organize to buy somebody, they would do that. I mean, they did what it took to get every individual they could out of slavery. And also there is Gerrit Smith, who I mentioned. Now, the day he walks in there, he is a leading member of the Colonization Society, but he's curious. Uriah Green's been working on him. And the disruption so upset him because it was an abrogation of free speech and the right to assemble. And so that's why he invites everybody to Peterborough. They can continue the convention the following day. They finish in peace. And within a year, Smith is no longer a colonizationist. He's the president of the New York Anti-Slavery Society. He is friends with Harriet Tubman. She comes to his house. She eats dinner with his family. He has an Underground Railroad station at his house. So he's doing everything that he wouldn't have done as a colonizationist. After the meetings disrupted in Utica, one of the things that happened is that the rioters, they went to Alvin Stewart's house and threatened to burn it down, but he had gotten a bunch of guys armed to defend it, so they said, well, maybe not today. So they ran down to the Standard and Democrat, which is an almost unknown abolitionist paper. There's very few copies of it left. So they took and threw the type out the windows of the second floor where it was being printed, and slightly delayed them being able to report on the riot. They threatened conventioners at the hotels. They were running around. The riot gave the leaders of Utica back some prestige, I think. And as I said, there might have been a Martin Van Buren plot involved. It also had reverberations in Utica. So now we're coming to the fourth and final of our very significant events, and that is the Utica Rescue. And in my opinion, what this rescue is going to show is that there's an increased militancy in Utica after the riot. Sometime in early 1836, a man named John Geyer dies in Woodstock, Virginia, in the Shenandoah County. He seems to have been a local official for the county, perhaps low level. His name is on a lot of witnessing marriages and land transfers and that kind of thing. The executor of his estate gives a guy named Sheriff Christian Miller power of attorney to arrest Harry Bird and George. They had, these two guys, been in Utica since September. Miller gets the sheriff in Utica, Sheriff Osborne and Chase, to arrest Harry Bird and George, hold them overnight, and then he brings them before this judge, Judge Chester Hayden, who was, by the way, one of the Committee of 25. So you can imagine how great that's going to be. Now, Harry Bird and George, they're not listed in the census records as slaves in Shenandoah County. John Geyer, the deceased, is listed as having slaves, but their names aren't recorded in the census. There is a George Bird who's listed as a free man in Woodstock. So let's assume that these two guys are the two guys that he's looking for. They're brought before Judge Chester Hayden. Shenandoah County at this time doesn't have large-scale slave plantations. According to the census records, people who own slaves usually have fewer than 4. Some people have as many as 21 people enslaved. But the percentage of people in the county who are held in slavery is like 12%. If you look at North Carolina in the same period, the number of people who are slaves are like 50%. So if a slaveholder dies and there's no kin, the slaves can pretty much assume that they're going to get sold. Now, if Harry Bird and George were free men who'd been working, say, for Geyer for a long time, you know, they might have lost their free papers, they might not be able to prove who they are, that they're free. We don't know. However, if those were the two guys, and we only have Sheriff Christian Miller's testimony to say that they were indeed these two guys, they decided to leave. Okay, 387 miles, if those roads existed, if you walked straight, you know, this is a major trip, a major escape. 327 miles. And they might have gone to New York City. There were people going there, getting help there. Ruggles is one of the Underground Railroad folks. Some of them took boats up to Albany and then went across in the canal or went straight up. But they ended up in Utica, so they might have gone on the canal, the Erie Canal. We don't know exactly. We're working on that. They show up in Post Street, which is where most of the black community lived in Utica. They might have found refuge there. They might have found a place to live and work. So they're arrested and brought before Judge Chester Hayden in this building, which still exists. Spencer Kellogg, who has a store a few doors away, sees a couple of guys being taken into Judge Chester Hayden's office, and he's like, "Hey, what's that about?" So he goes into the court, and he's told that these two men are being arrested for stealing potatoes. But he listens, and the judge is whispering to a local lawyer who's helping Christian Miller, and they're whispering, and he's like, what are you saying? And he finds out that instead of being arrested for stealing potatoes, that they're being arrested as runaway slaves. So he quickly reacts and says that he needs to get Alvin Stewart in. All right, so this is a picture with horses there, so you can tell it's old. I don't know exactly when. This is the bridge over the Erie Canal. So that's Alvin Stewart's law office. That building still exists. Spencer Kellogg's store would have been right here. This is a different building than it was in the 1836. And Judge Chester Hayden, you see how close everything is. So somebody runs over, gets Stewart, and they come back to Hayden's office. Stewart says he needs time to prepare a defense and that these guys should be considered free unless proven otherwise, and that they deserve a trial by jury. And the judge rejects the trial by jury, but he says to Stewart, okay, you can have some time to get your stuff together. And the lawyer acting for Christian Miller also seeks a delay, so the judge postpones it until 6:30 that night. And he decides to lock Harry Bird and George in a room at his office. And he goes to the courthouse where the Committee of 25 gathered themselves, and he stays there for 6 hours. Doing what? I don't know exactly. Meanwhile, people are collecting themselves in the street. Word has gone out to Post Street. The African American community is getting involved. People come up and visit the prisoners. They check out what the office is like. They go upstairs. They're looking at the doors. They gather in the street at about 6 p.m. This capture of Harry Bird and George seems to have unleashed pent-up anger amongst the African American community and the abolitionists in Utica. They've seen two riots, 1834 and 1835, and they decide to push back. At 6:15, a signal is given, and both the African Americans and white folks force open the door where the two men are locked in, and after a severe struggle with the officers who are on guard, they successfully manage to spirit them away. So, this is the jail. where Christian Miller wanted to bring Harry, Bird, and George. And this is where we believe they ended up instead. Okay? Any questions or